So, welcome everyone to the Artist Exchange event. Today, Pamela Blotner is welcoming artists Jane Skafte and Jamie Treacy. And I'd love to introduce Pamela in all her glory, but I don't have my notes. But just let me tell you that Pamela is quite an amazing and broad artist and educator, and has done work all over the country, if not, I don't know, the world too, Pamela?
A little bit.
And so Pamela, please go forward with the introductions.
Okay, our two artists today, as Shelley has just said, Jamie Treacy and Jane Skafte, are both artists and educators who approach their work in a similar way. They each look directly at the landscape or the wildlife that is their subject matter. They look directly at it, while at the same time thinking about the science and the biology behind it and finding their own story in it. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jane Skafte. In her Virginia farmhouse studio, Jane Skafte creates paintings and drawings that look at the awesome terrors of nature, including tsunamis, erosion, and earthquakes. And now those things are compounded by abusive human interventions like clear-cutting forests, fracking, and CO2 emissions. She explores these issues in a very interesting way, and I will let her go ahead and tell you about it. Jane.
Thank you, Pamela. Okay, so I'll just introduce my work really briefly and then go to some slides. So nature has always been a source of inspiration, and all my work reflects a profound appreciation for the environment. And I kind of toggle back and forth nowadays between more poetic depictions of nature and more realism. And it's sort of a function of where I'm living right now. I have a lot of inspiration from the farm where I live. So I end up doing things that are not controversial and beautiful instead of scientific, but still I'm still holding that same sensibility. But when wildfires and ocean levels rose and the collapse of ecosystems, I started taking my concerns into depicting the climate crisis and using my work as a platform to raise awareness. Some of these pieces are a few years old, and they're old enough actually to, I don't remember which date it was, but I had a show and somebody asked me about my work, and I said, well, it has to do with climate change. And she said, oh, do you believe in that? And I just thought it was so funny. Nowadays, no one would ask me that. You know, it reflects a raising of consciousness, I think. So let's try the slides, and then I can talk over them. Starting really from early expressions, like back when I was in an undergraduate, I became interested in these strange depictions of the landscape that were in this kind of two-point perspective, where it showed the cross-section and interior of the Earth's crust. And I just thought they were very funny. These pictures were funny. And I was kind of interested in perspective. And so I was leaning on these illustrations, which came out of dictionaries and middle school textbooks, that kind of thing. So they're not, you know, nowadays there's artists, there's whole studios that devote themselves to this kind of illustration, and they're incredibly beautiful. But this one that you're looking at is similar to what was my original inspiration, which were just kind of strange, strange landscapes that didn't seem quite naturalistic enough. They were just kind of weird expressions of a fault line. And I think that there's a lot of material from, you know, that are dated, like this kind of an illustration of the crust, being able to see things under the surface, how decay has formed in the layers into, you know, coal deposits, or how the mantle will shift with an earthquake or a volcano. And I really got turned on by this illustrator, Diderot. And these were sort of, I borrowed a lot from these illustrations, where I just thought they were so funny because they were quite out of scale, at least to my mind. This human scale was exaggerated. I could be wrong, but I like the use of the human form walking around inside the planet this way. I thought those were quite amusing. And so I also loved the way they were rendered. And so I borrowed quite a bit of this artist's work. This is what, 18th century or something. So this was an early piece of mine, and I called them disguised autobiography, where so my sense of it was that sort of like post-traumatic stress, and using that as a metaphor, that if you had a childhood trauma, it would be like a fault line inside your personality, which wouldn't emerge until some outer event triggered it again. And so you living in California know that you can live on the fault line and live quite nicely until something shifts, and then all bets are off. And so I was looking at these really as a personal expression of my family and my early childhood, but using the language of this kind of landscape. This one is called Tsunami, and it's extension of what the earlier one that was autobiographical, where I was just really enjoying the language of of this kind of geometry on the landscape, which was kind of an unnatural marriage of two art forms. I started to explore how many other ways people have depicted the landscape, and including mythological references. So I know in different Asian cosmologies, and I think in some Native American cosmologies, there's a reference to a sea turtle holding the planet on its back. And sometimes you see a sea turtle sort of floating through outer space. Sometimes it's swimming. Sometimes the sea turtle has elephants on its back, and they're holding the earth. And I think that accounts for, shifts in, an earthquake or something could be blamed on an elephant, perhaps. So this piece was called Cosmic Turtle. and this is all colored pencil. I started thinking about imposing animals into the landscape. I like the, you know, taking liberties in the scale in the same way that that Diderot thing was. But using a monumental scale for the image here of the livestock. So this is almost like a time lapse where if you start on the left, you have a virgin rainforest. As you proceed to the middle, it's starting to be cut down and burned. And then toward the right, there's actually little livestock on that plateau there. So it's all been turned into land for grazing. And there's the monumentality of the destruction that is caused by our, you know, misuse of the environment in the Amazon. And this one is, it was referring to a place in northern Alaska, which I caught on National Geographic or something, where the whole town had started to sink, and of a cubist drawing of being able to see that fracturing plane, the planes that are fracturing as the ground level just shifts and sinks. And toward the right of that drawing are these trees that they refer to as drunken trees because they're all falling down because their root system doesn't have anything to hold. And this one is also about melting, but this one is in Antarctica. And a lot of times when I start a drawing like this, I'm not sure where it's going to go. And I started this one from the right and moved left. So I was just kind of interested in seeing the water level moving down, and the hawk, which isn't quite a phoenix, but it became sort of a phoenix symbol, kind of entered in to represent the two elements of heat and cold, since now all of that is starting to melt. This one is kind of a mashup of different elements, where what you're seeing is bleached coral and red tide, and so there's a I'm not sure what kind of fish that is, but they're all of the fish that have washed up because of the change in chemistry in the from too warm ocean water. So on the left, you sort of have another one of those time lapse depictions where you can see the coral reef, which is still lively and beautiful and colorful. And then on the right, it's turned into just skeletal. Here's the elephant. We don't see the sea turtle this time. But again, I'm playing with the scale of wildlife, the monumental scale of wildlife. So in this case, this would be one of those elephants holding the planet. In this case, it's being affected by clear cutting and landslides that have just crushed the elephant. So I did my best to draw mud kind of dripping, calling it mudslide. Ghost forest, and it refers to the little, some people have said, oh, I thought it was a graveyard. And those little projections on the surface of the that plane are actually it's a forest that was unearthed in Oregon because of erosion, and possibly a tsunami had created the change in the shore, so that the entire forest went underwater and was killed because of salt water. We're having the same problem in Virginia and in North Carolina, where because of the destruction of the shore and erosion and the shifting wetlands, or sometimes wetlands being turned into agricultural land. The introduction of salt water is killing the forest along the shore. So, and this one does refer to California, and this is the wildfires. And the way this one started is sort of, I knew I was designing something that had to do with the wildfires encroaching on this community. And I wanted this, it kind of came to me in a dream that I wanted a foot in there, a carbon footprint. And I thought, I know that there's something from the Renaissance that has a wonderful foot. And so I started researching, and it was Michelangelo. And so I actually just designed this around that guy's foot. But then it was sort of like my subconscious had developed this whole narrative, because the story of this is from the Sistine Chapel. And it's depicting the story in Genesis where God says, "Let there be light." And it's the creation of the moon and stars and the sun. And I just thought that was such an apt image for what we've done to destroy our environment by the misuse of energy extraction. So that's how that one came together. And I have a lot more work, but that's all I've got to show you for today.
But for right now, I'm going to turn to Jamie Treacy, who's California-based, and as I said, he's an art educator and an artist. But the one thing that you don't know is that he's a U.S. Masters swimmer. So I'm going to let him tell you about that. His artwork, as he writes, is imbued with themes of eco-justice, speculative fiction, and exobiology. He draws inspiration from his hikes in the Oakland Hills and from his childhood walks in the forests of Michigan. For Jamie, as for many of us, the natural world is restorative and very much needs our restoration and protection. Thank you. Jamie.
Thanks so much, Pamela, for that introduction. And Jane, that was a really inspirational sharing of your work. There's a few things that immediately jumped out to me as areas of connection between our work, and that's the idea of like a person scale in relationship to the landscape. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some work that has a very intimate scale. So we get the sense that you are maybe a person who is on your knees or kneeling down in the forest or peering through the forest. So, and if we kind of contrast that from what the work we just saw from from Jane, where we were looking at the landscape from above and looking at these figures that were very far away. I'm going to be kind of taking you on a voyage into a very intimate world. I wanted to start with a few of my colored pencil drawings that were from a time when I first moved to California. I grew up in Michigan, and I grew up swimming, like Pamela said in the intro, but I had never really swam in the ocean, and the ocean was kind of a scary place for me, both with the plant life that I encountered and also the marine life. And I am an open water swimmer. So a few times a week, I'm out in the San Francisco Bay swimming in the ocean. And, you know, these series of drawings really started from my fascination with, you know, the ever-changing vistas on the beach, whether they be kind of these strewn kelp remnants or different kinds of strange jellyfish and all different kinds of worms and all these strange things that wash up on the beach in California. And this work back in 2009 didn't have much of a deeper connotation for me yet. Wasn't really connected to those environmental and eco-justice themes yet, because it was more about the technical challenge of kind of how Jane was talking about the rendering, the way rendering happens and the way we kind of understand an object through a close study. So I also started to experiment, connecting back to our theme of biology and the sciences. I started to experiment with this point of view where it's almost like you are looking down and examining something at a very intimate scale. You're not quite sure how big you are in relationship to the subject matter. But I was just really interested in bringing myself as close as possible to like botanical forms and things like algae and lichen and moss. And right now, in 2009, it was still curiosity. It wasn't really connected to having a statement about what was going on in the environment. And I wasn't really educated enough about it yet. And I was really just curious about how can I learn through this act of deep observation. So these colored pencil drawings were all created in 1 year. And I had the idea actually from Jane to show some of these to you before I dive into my acrylic paintings, because in a way they were foundational to the work I'm currently making. And what they allowed me to do is really focus on something hyper local. So things that are right near me, right near my house, and really look for the mysterious and the beautiful and the sometimes terrifying moments that are like right at my feet, right in my fingertips, whether it's in the woods near me or even in my backyard or in a little puddle, and then really make that my subject matter. So the work in this current series are acrylic paintings. And these acrylic paintings really center around the forest in the East Bay Hills. So thinking about Redwood Regional Park and Anthony Chabot Regional Park and all the areas that exist right at the edge of Oakland. And one thing that I find so special about living in Oakland, California, is that I live in a very urban environment. I have access to all kinds of wonderful art museums and technology, but then in 10 minutes, I can be in the complete wilderness. And I started to create this series that was loosely connected around the idea of witnessing growth. And I really started to think about how so much in California goes through a latent stage where it's like, looks like it's dead, or it looks like it's never gonna make a comeback. And this is kind of a very close-up of kind of a network of roots of fern. And we've got a lot of beautiful ferns in California. And I was really interested in kind of making it feel unclear how big it was in comparison to us. This is a 3 foot by 4 foot painting. And this painting started in 2014. And I was kind of the least successful painting of a previous series. And then just a few years ago, I decided there's something there. I want to keep working on it. So I created a whole nother iteration of it. So I kept much of the same structure and composition of the fern, but I kind of added this mysterious kind of ethereal landscape behind it. And I'm really interested in this type of composition where you have something that is almost like undeniably in your face, like you could reach out and touch it, or it's it's a branch that might hit you in the face, but then you also can see this deep space. And part of that is inspired by when I was an undergraduate, I studied in Kyoto, Japan, and I was really fascinated by the visual device that many of the ukiyo-e printmakers would use, where they would use tree branches to frame something in the deep space, like Mount Fuji. So like something very, very intimate, something very, very palpable with something very kind of far away and mysterious. So that's kind of this piece. And then this next one, it's called Where the Hillside Fell Away. During these same hikes, I became really interested in all the underworkings of a tree and just how it's a whole ecosystem unto itself. And despite all the erosion that we experience because of such dry hillsides, I mean, sometimes you just look at these trees and they're just like hanging on by a thread. And so this is a view of underneath the tree and all of the kind of mystery that happens. And I've definitely enhanced the color. I'm really interested in using kind of mundane subject matter that you just might find on a walk, but presenting it in a way where the color is utilized to summon emotion. And when I think about, Jane, what you were saying about how there's an autobiographical connection to your work, that really rings true with me too. I think a lot about how, when I look back at a piece from a few years ago, I remember how I was feeling. And my biggest goal is like, I want to elicit emotion. And, maybe that could inspire compassion for something that's overlooked, like, a little area under a tree, but also just kind of tap into like the almost abstract feelings that these very intimate forest vistas bring up. This piece is one of the largest in the series, and I'm actually doing one now that's the same size. It's 62 by 72 inches, and it was part of the DeYoung Open exhibit here in San Francisco. And it's another view under the tree. And as a kind of an interesting challenge, I started to feature a lot of spider webs in my work and became really fascinated with the architecture that spider webs bring to a piece that's very, organic and full of nodules and ripples and, crevices. But then when a spider's web is in there, it brings all these straight lines and angles. So again, I'm appreciating, Jane, what you were saying about superimposing the geometric on the organic. That for me, that a spider's web kind of does that. And I became really interested in also how they would kind of coil around each other and make like almost little apertures that you could look through. And again, as a technical challenge, I loved working with these deep spaces that felt like they could just go on forever, almost like we're entering into a cavern. And I'm fascinated by creating paintings that are both like a little bit repulsive and maybe a little scary, but also alluring. So like the idea that like, what is in there? What could get me? Is there a spider that's going to pop out? Is there something that's going to get me? But then also like painting it with really lush, saturated color and kind of using this kind of composition to pull you in. So this piece, actually the next two pieces are from a series that I'm doing connected to Joshua Tree and the plant, the Joshua trees. I have a whole series of drawings and photos that I took down in Joshua Tree National Park. And God, talk about a dry place. I mean, like you just look at the Joshua tree up close oftentimes, and it's just like, it's amazing that it's alive. And there's kind of carcasses of them everywhere around the desert in Southern California. And as structures, they're really fascinating. Like it's a part of I think I, in another life, would have liked to have been a scientific illustrator, because I love looking at plants up close and understanding how they're held together. And so this piece is very up close. And I've been working with these kind of spines and needles and all these different little cellular openings in the trunk of that Joshua tree for a few years. And what I love about it is that it's very hard to tell what it is, but it just kind of speaks to something that's very internal. It almost feels like it could be the inside of a body. This piece is kind of a partner piece to the one that you just saw. They're the same size. It's called Barely a Monument, Hopefully a Creature. And while I'm making my work, I'll just kind of leave you with a little bit of my connection to science fiction. I really love looking for just painting something very mundane, like a dead tree that's kind of leaning over, and imagining what else it could be, and imagining it through the eyes of someone who's trying to learn, like almost like a scientist who's trying to learn about something so unfamiliar that they just have to describe it in very vague, descriptive terms because it's so unfamiliar. And that's kind of my interest in exobiology. I love reading authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and Octavia Butler and M.R. Carey. And then there's an author named Adrian Tchaikovsky, who wrote a book called The Children of Time, that kind of looks at evolution, and particularly of spiders, like kind of going on a whole nother trajectory than it is right now. And that kind of stuff really inspires me. And so a lot of times when I'm making paintings, I am listening to audiobooks that are feeding some of my titles that are kind of kooky and just like the kind of fantastical elements of these very mundane and kind of observed landscapes that I'm pulling from. These last two pieces really are thinking about the air quality. So they're both called Return Each One to the Wind, Part 1 and Part 2. And in California, most people on this call, I'm sure know, we have had some really scary days of like poor air quality where our air is just like, you know, toxic to breathe. But it presents us with such strange landscapes, such strange atmospheric perspective, and connecting to Jane's interest in perspective too. I teach my students a lot about atmosphere and how to create a sense of atmosphere. And as a painter, I've really taken it on as a challenge, like how do I capture this kind of sense that things are emerging out of the smoke and becoming something that you can kind of understand, and then it kind of dissipates into the smoke again or into the fog. So again, very, very intimate, almost like we're like the size of an insect. And then there's this like strange, foggy world around them. And I just wanted to close by just saying a little bit about what eco-justice means, in case you haven't heard that term before. So in contrast to the environmental justice movement, which is really about advocating for our, our spaces, our oceans, our forests, the eco-justice movement connects our systemic problems around facing individuals, communities, and the natural world all together. So it's kind of like how all of the stuff that's happening in the environment also affects us. And so that really speaks to me. And that term was brought to me by someone viewing my work, and I've really latched onto it because it's about that like emotional connection between us and the landscape, and us and the plant world. And I think that about brings me to the end of my part. And we're gonna share the opportunities later, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. That was great. Okay, now's the time for a conversation between these two artists. And do you have questions for each other, or shall we open up?
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, I loved going to your website and seeing your work. I'm very inspired by it, really. And some of the things that you wrote about your work, you said that you were using abstraction as a way of examining your shadow self.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, to hear you elaborate on that.
Yeah, so that's kind of a separate body of work that definitely has natural organic forms in it, but those pieces are much more abstract. And my last show really looked at the idea of shadow work, or the hidden parts of our psyche that we most often would like to avoid looking at. But when we really do look at them, that's where our real growth happens. And I started to connect that to when you are working in an abstract way, and when you're working figuratively, but abstraction, it's really easy to repeat yourself. It's really easy to kind of fall into comfortable behaviors and creative decisions. And the connection to shadow work is like when you're really looking at changing something about yourself. Like for me, maybe it's like, as a man in a meeting, looking at not dominating the discussion too much and learning how to step back and be a better listener. It's really about changing those subconscious behaviors. So that was a really interesting connection to me, because I was like, well, what if I can use my abstract work as a tool to kind of talk about this work that I'm doing within myself, about what are the things I want to change and what are the things I want to shift in my work. So when I'm making a painting, it can kind of come up in the sense that I am more ready to recognize when I'm repeating myself and when I'm not innovating and when I'm kind of stuck in a rut. And, in this last year of working on our own, during quarantine, that was really necessary. I kind of had to be more critical of myself and figure out some thinking routines to get myself past those places where I was really stuck in my work. And at that same time, the racial justice reckoning in our country is happening, and I'm part of all these groups, and I'm really doing some intense work on myself. And I realized that there was a lot of connection there. You know, this kind of emotional unearthing of like, okay, what am I comfortable with? What do I need to let go of? What do I need to hold dear? And that's kind of where the connection to shadow work came from.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Jane, one thing that stood out to me when I was listening to you talk about your work on our dry run day and in your emails, you talked about like coming to the topic of climate change through like a brokenheartedness of feeling, you know, how, you know, just a little bit of, maybe I'm putting this into your words, but maybe the hopelessness or just like the kind of fear of facing climate change. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that is still coming up for you, or if there's been kind of an evolution in your work as you've been kind of taking this topic on over this last several years. Do you still feel like that brokenheartedness?
And I don't know how to reconcile some of the awareness of, you know, how I don't know, like every day my husband and I get up, we do the New York Times crossword puzzle, and we read the paper, and it just feels like we're living in an entirely different world than the one that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. That every day there's a tragedy. You know, so many people have lost their lives during floods and fires, and you know, it's just like around the country there's just this acceleration of tragedy, and so yeah, it bothers me a lot. It's just something to give over to my meditation, I think, because it's kind of hopeless to feel like, what do I do now? I mean, how do you feel about it?
I feel similarly. Like once you know about an issue like the sea level rise killing off the forest because of the salt water. And I was thinking, you know, one of the things that really hit me in the gut was when the starfish wasting disease started to really affect the Pacific coast, and swimmers and scuba divers started to seeing piles and piles of dismembered starfish on the sea floor. And it was, again, you're talking about the water temperature changing, a parasite that is now surviving in these warmer Pacific waters that is affecting starfish. And once you hear and once you learn about something like that as an artist, that kind of fascination, but also sadness, you can't get rid of it. It's, you know, and when you're out in the forest too, like I think so much of the bountiful Midwestern summers that I had that were just so full of, you know, we never worried about water, and you know, there was always rain right around the corner. And then in California, it's so beautiful as well, but you also see the struggling and the striving, and just seeing how it affects people too. And I just think so much about you know, our desire to live in proximity to nature and in the proximity to trees. Like so much of what we have going on in California is these small towns that are in the mountains and are really in these beautiful places underneath the canopy of the trees. But we know all too well how risky that is to live among the trees when wildfires are so dangerous. And that really breaks my heart too, because I've dreamed of living in the mountains, and I've dreamed of one day, you know, moving away from the city and being surrounded by trees. But it's been hard to reconcile like the kind of fear I feel for the climate change that we're experiencing right now, and then also just feeling more confident to talking about it and being more confident to using my artwork as a jumping off point into having some of those hard conversations about how we are in the world.
Yeah. Well put.
I'm going to jump in and ask a question in that I know, Jane, and I know you have a good sense of humor, and I know that that's how sometimes you relieve tension. And I think you're probably that way too, Jamie. Plus the fact that you have some extraordinary titles that I'm going to completely flub, but you have one that's something like Succumbing to Wood Rot. And that kind of humor creeping into the work, does that happen often? Do you let that happen, either or both of you?
Yeah, I loved your titles, Jane.
Oh, thank you, Jane.
You're quite a poet.
I really love the process of coming up with a title too, and I like to think about oftentimes there's like a little bit of like clumsiness, you know, like, because I oftentimes feel like these are scenes that you like are stumbling upon. So the title should also have a stumbling quality to it, like whether you're like succumbing to some natural force or you're like giving in to something or something is taking over. And then also I really am interested in creating a painting that's almost like a conditional event. Like sometimes I'll name something like, if this happens, you know, if the wind arrives, or if the rain falls. And I'm just really interested in playing with our sense of time too. Like it doesn't have to be an event in the past. It could be something conditional that might happen.
You've never been led down that road, Jane?
I'm sorry, what?
You've never been led down the road of including your sense of humor?
Not for these particular pieces, but yeah, I mean, that is what keeps me going, Pamela, is I have sort of a dark sense of humor. And some of these very dark subjects.
Well, I think there was a connection to what you were saying about the funny illustrations that you would find in the middle school textbooks, and then using that visual language. To me, that had some humor behind it, because it's very recognizable, like, oh, that's how I learned about the mantle and the Earth's crust. And yeah, but you're presenting it to us in a really dramatic way, where it is fractured apart, and it's, you know, something. And I loved your connection to mythology too. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I wanted, and I probably am going to get this all wrong, but when you raised the idea of brokenheartedness, I recently read Elizabeth Colbert I think her name is Colbert, Colbert, I think. It's Stephen Colbert and Elizabeth Colbert. Okay, and she wrote a book recently called Under a White Sky, and she's a brilliant writer in terms of climate and the changes that are going on. Under a White Sky, to me, felt more hopeful than a lot of her other books that were much more frightening and sad and scary, and just like, the world is ending. To me, it felt like this is ending, but the world isn't ending. And she gave a lot of examples about how people are reacting to the parts of the environment, or the temperature of the oceans, or whatever, things that are completely off the charts, out of control, and how scientists are learning to address that. And it gave me this feeling of, because as a grandmother, I feel like, what kind of world is there going to be for our grandchildren? And her book, which I recommend, gave me hope that it's going to be a very different world, but there's going to be intelligence, and there's going to be reactions to things that we can't even conceive of, but there's going to be intelligence. So anyway, I'm not going to try to, because I'm not a scientist, I'll just get all the facts wrong. So I just recommend you read the book.
At this point, let's, unless you two have anything else you'd like to say, why don't we open this up to our guests and see what they might be thinking?
Perfect.
Guests?
I'd like to make a comment.
Please.
Okay, so James and Jane, I just loved your work, and I think also I was struck by you know, what colorists both of you are. I mean, the work works so beautifully together, you know, and actually the colors were breathtaking, even though the subjects may be disturbing. And I recently came across this quote, so I'd like to share it with you because it really made me think of both of your work. And it's by Rilke. And it says, "Our task is to take this earth so deeply and wholly into ourselves that it will resurrect within our being." And I really got that feeling from both of your pieces, you know, the works of them, that, you know, that idea, there's revelation, but there is that resurrection. You know, I find them very hopeful, and, you know, and like I said, you know, the subject matter may be disturbing, but the color overcomes it. You know, I just never, it didn't depress me, you know, there was just something very uplifting. So congratulations. I just think they're beautiful.
Thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
We
That quote gave me chills.
Yeah, Joni has her hand up.
right.
Oh.
Yeah. Hey,
Hi,
Jane. You said you wanted somebody from the East Coast, and I was so excited.
So delighted to see you.
Yeah, so excited to have you show those pencil drawings, that pencil paintings that we have enjoyed so much over the years. And just a couple of comments. The wildfires in California, also for you, James. My son-in-law is out in California. He's outgrown being able to be on the line, but he does mapping. And so he's working on the river complex fire.
Oh my gosh.
So you have fires racing towards a creek, a stream, a river, and the towns along it. And it's only 40% contained, and who knows what will happen with that. So it's the fire part of out west really is upsetting.
Yes.
And years ago, when the Syrian war first started, Thomas Friedman said that it was a climate change war because the farmers were no longer able to grow bread or grow the wheat. And now they're all suffering from a lack of water. And on NPR this morning, they were talking about the dire lack of water in Syria. So some things can be colored beautifully, but which is great, which is wonderful. But on the ground, people are still suffering, whether it's out west or in the east or anywhere. So anyway, yours, I love your paintings, James. They're gorgeous. I have a friend who hikes here in Virginia and the Smokies and takes close-up pictures. So his photographs kind of emulate what you're talking about.
Yeah, I love the Smoky Mountains.
The Colbert book, Jane, the white sky was from what? From geoengineering, where you put the sulfur dioxide in the air and it
Right.
turns the sky white. Well, there's a local writer here in Harrisonburg area that's written a cli-fi called Krill, and it's sort of based on the same thing. A person with the greatest intention in the world funded putting sulfur dioxide in the air, and what happens as a result of that. So it's yeah, all sorts of things going on amongst artists, but not so much amongst the politicians.
And if you were moved by today's presentation and want to support the work that Gallery Route 1 does to bring art to the community, then please visit our website and donate today. And make a note in the comments that your donation is because of today's Artist Exchange event. And we hope to see you at our next event happening on October 20th. Thanks again, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next time.